Welcome to the 2024 fall series of watercolors with Caroline. There'll be 8 lessons, and the title for this series is Skies, Silhouettes and Other Stuff. The other stuff is 2 Christmas cards that I have prepared for you in this series. We'll do one next week and then one in week, I think 4 or 5. So you have plenty of time to print your cards if you want to. The lesson we're doing today is called Heron in the Mist. And the reference photo is by Lois Phillips. Thank you so much for this beautiful photo, Lois. A little bit shorter than our usual ones and a nice easy start to the season. So get your brushes ready and your paints ready and let's paint together. Right then, so in my little notebook where I keep all my notes on colour, this is where I try out a whole bunch of different colours to see what's going to work for this painting, and I found that a number of colors worked depending on whether you want a sort of a more muted painting or a brighter painting. I liked the Quin Gold, but Quin Gold is very staining and can be a bit difficult to deal with, so in the end I went with the Azo Yellow and Burnt Sienna sort of mix. I also liked the Azo Yellow and Raw Sienna mix. It was more creamy. And the first little one I did, this one here, is just done with raw sienna and burnt sienna. So it's a more creamy sort of look. And then this one is much brighter. This has the Azo Yellow and the burnt sienna in it. So it makes it brighter. So it depends on what you have and what look you want. If you want a more creamy, misty, orangey glow, I think the raw sienna and burnt sienna is a good choice. But if you want something a little bit brighter, then the Azo Yellow with some burnt sienna or cadmium yellow with burnt sienna is a good choice. So it is up to you. All of these different mixes did the job. They all were okay. I just picked out my favorites, and every time I do it, it turns out differently. This was another one that I scrubbed out yesterday to show someone how you can scrub out. So this was a glaze of quinacridone gold over the yellow and everything else. So you get all kinds of different looks. Let's put that away for a moment. And we'll definitely need to use the hairdryer for this, because once we get this first wash on, we got to dry it completely. So let's just zoom in a little bit. The trouble is, when it zooms, you get only half the paper. I don't want you to have half the paper for the moment. So we're going to start by making up a little bit of paint ready, and then it's easiest to get a nice clean wash if you wet the whole paper first. So let's, I've got 1 pot of water for cleaning my brush and another pot of water just for putting a clean wash on first. I got a brand new brush. I got a lovely new silver black velvet 3/4 inch flat brush. So I've been practicing with this. I don't use them very often, but it's been nice to have something new to practice with. So right, so what I'm going to mix up for mine is I want to mix up just some Azo Yellow by itself. So I have some nice bright yellow. I want to mix up some Azo Yellow with some burnt sienna in it, because I want that to be more a creamy yellow. Just having a little bit of burnt sienna in there makes it a little bit sort of a more creamy color, especially when it's diluted. And I also want to have some burnt sienna ready to just put some burnt sienna in there. So I have a little bit of variation. I got to make sure I've got enough, because once you start, you don't want to run out of paint halfway through. That's never good. I'm going to put a little bit more, just tone that one down just a little bit. Right, so I have my colors ready. And now the clean water. I've got to make sure I go in the right pot. And the thing that the flat brush is very good for is for getting a nice even wet surface. So I want to make sure I've got an even wet surface here. Now, wetting your paper is how you get a lovely soft blending of all your colours. And you need to tip your paper towards the light and just see if you've missed any spots. You don't want a dry spot in there anywhere. And make sure that your whole paper is shiny, so wet. And then I'm going to get a Kleenex, and I don't want any back runs, so I'm going to just make sure I get the water off of the masking tape so it doesn't back run into my wash and make a big cauliflower from the side. And give it another look, make sure I haven't taken too much. And I have taken a little bit too much off the edge, I've dried it too much, so I'm going to put a little bit more back there. Now, I still prefer working with a round brush. I find, for me, the flat brush gives me too much of a linear look to things. I find the round brush is better. I'm going to start with my mostly Azo Yellow mix at the top of the sky. I've got my number 10 brush here. I'm going to load it up with the yellow mix, and I'm going to graduate the color. So I'm going to go yellow, bright yellow, and then I'm going to go into the yellow and burnt sienna mix, and then bright yellow again, and then I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna across where the sort of looks like there's a little bit of a horizon there. You can't really see a horizon, but it gives the illusion of one on the photograph. So across horizontally, I've got a dust bunny in there already. Very gently, just gently with your brush. Now I'm going to go into the mix, which is the burnt sienna and the Azo Yellow mix. I want it stronger in the middle. I'm going to go right over the Heron, right over anything else that's going to be on there. So I'm in the mix still. And then I'm going to go back to the just Azo Yellow towards the bottom of the paper. Now, it did look like there was a sort of a horizon there, so I'm going to take the burnt sienna and I'm just going to add a touch above the bird, about an inch above the bird. I'm going to add a touch of burnt sienna there. It has to be very, very subtle, really, really subtle. And then this is where the sponge comes in use. It's completely dry because I want to get texture. And I'm going to rub the sponge, ooh, it makes a good noise, rub the sponge in the burnt sienna. And this is what I'm going to use for the first trees that are in the mist. I'm just going to, they're coming out quite a ways. I'm just going to pop them in with the sponge. And if I find that the texture is a bit too hard and regular, this is where I'm going to use my Kleenex, and I'm going to take a little bit of that off where it kind of disappears into the mist. I don't want to take too much off because I don't want to take all the yellow off, just a little bit. Now this is going to dry a lot lighter, so I don't have to worry too much. And then we're going to have a second layer of trees and then a third layer of trees. So this will really go into the background. If you don't have a sponge, another tool that works really well is a big soft brush like this. They're very cheap. You can either get a goat's hair one from an Asian shop, or this one's probably just a man-made one. It's made in China. I don't think it's anything special. And it's dry. I need to get a little bit more burnt sienna mixed up. A little puddle. Now I'm just going to put the dry bristles into the burnt sienna. I've already got some tree on there, and I can always use a towel if I feel I need to control this. And again, I can use that to make a kind of a leaf texture, a very gentle leaf texture. And I'll use this more when I make the leaf texture up here with the darker browns. Right now we just want this one just disappearing into the mist. Now, if you do mop up with the Kleenex, don't press hard because you'll take off all your yellow if you press too hard. And I'm going to... Now, the lady that took this, I found her on BC Photos and wrote to her, and she's just lovely, Lois Phillips, and asked her permission, and she said yes, she'd love that if we used her photo and any other photos she has on my Fort Langley. It's Fort Langley, where she lives, and I sent her the first painting that I did as a thank you. So I'm quite free to print this. She's given me permission. Some of the groups don't give permission for that, but she definitely has. You can see my paintings a lot more, comes out a lot more yellow. Hers is much more muted. So what we've done with the sponge is we've tried to put this very, very misty tree in the background. I'll keep this handy. Now you kind of know when it's possible to go to the hairdryer, and that's when, if you tilt your painting, all of the shine has gone from the wetness. It goes kind of a satiny, don't know how to describe it. I always struggle with this, but it's not shiny. It's not shiny and wet, but it's definitely not dry yet because the paper is still bubbled up. Now mine is just about ready to dry with the hairdryer. You don't want to go too soon because you stop that paint from moving in the water and diffusing. And what you want is a lovely diffused look, especially in a misty painting. So I'm going to just mute and dry with the hairdryer. Hey, that is definitely dry enough to work on. I avoided putting my hairdryer near the masking tape because I don't want to melt the glue and have the picture lift up. So remember that if you're using your hairdryer, don't put any heat on the masking tape and make sure you keep pushing it down or it will all pop up. And then your painting will shrink in some places and it will be an odd shape. It will be shrunken in some places and still taped down in others, and it will kind of curl at the sides. Now, I have been stretching some of my paintings, but I didn't stretch this one today. I was a little bit lazy. So we've put a little bit of burnt sienna in for the trees, and I've said we dry it. Now we're going to use the burnt sienna for a few more trees, and also we're going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue to the burnt sienna to make it slightly darker. And this is going to be our medium value. Now, I want to caution you about the one thing that people struggled with yesterday. We basically have 1, 2, 3 layers of trees, very light, medium light, and then slightly darker with a little bit of 4th layer more dark. Now, what people did yesterday, and I think it's just that we all get carried away painting, is they did the first layer and then they did the second layer over the first layer, and then they did the third layer over the first and second layer. So what they ended up with was dark trees all the way out to here. We didn't see, whoops, I now got paint on this one. We didn't see the 3 distinct layers on a lot of people's paintings yesterday. So I'm going to make you aware of that before we start the next layer, is that this misty tree out here is not going to get painted over. We're going to see it. Our next layer is going to come sort of around here, and then the third layer closer to the side. So what you want to see is a distinct 3 different values of tree. But of course we're going to overlap the trees, but we don't want to bring them all out this way. So this is going to be our second misty layer, which is in the photograph sort of just here. It's not that much darker. See this here, kind of a little bit darker. So we're going to use the burnt sienna, and I'm going to have some burnt sienna on its own just right here, but that's very orangey and bright. So I'm also going to have some burnt sienna mixed with a little tiny bit of ultramarine blue. I'm going to grab, not a lot. Now we're going to go to a lot of ultramarine blue later when we go even darker. So we want to take this down just slightly darker, just slightly more bluey grey. We're not going into the dark, dark, dark trees yet. And that's how you're going to get your layers. We're going to work on dry paper now. And we'll use the Kleenex, we'll use the brush, the sponge, a little bit of water on our brush to make that misty, that second misty layer. So if you want, I'm going to dip my sponge in the burnt sienna and the mix that I just made. And I'm going to see what that looks like for my second layer coming out. And I'm going to do a bit of work with the brush too. Let's zoom in so you can see a little better. And I want my Kleenex handy because I don't want it too strong. And I'm also going to use, I'm going to get the, bring this over here. You can get the darker brown I just made on my brush and tap my brush on a sponge here and get a little bit of that sort of darker foliage going with that dry brush. And then what I'm going to use now is just water on my brush, and I'm going to soften some of this so it's even more misty, just softening that. And don't worry too much about back here because we're going to go even darker back here, but we want to have it in there so it's behind the next layer. Now I'm going to use my brush now and grab some of that slightly darker brown, still with my Big 10 brush, and I want to be putting in some of this misty. I need even more water. So got a little bit. I've just got water on my brush now. Nothing but water on my brush. I'm just going to move this mist along with that. Pick up a little bit more paint. Now we're going to have a line along here later. Don't worry about it now. We're just going to put the reflections in for now. These are reflections of the trees in the water. Very, very misty reflections. And at this stage you'll start to doubt yourself because you've got nothing dark in the picture and it's all focused on this pale brown color, and you're going to feel it's not looking right. Don't doubt yourself at this stage. You've got a lot more to go. And I'm also going to use my Kleenex. If I feel anything's a little bit too harsh, I can just dab a little bit up. So what we've just put in is this sort of second layer of trees and this very, very misty reflection in the lake. We're going to go darker in the next layer, but don't worry about that yet. We're going to get this medium layer in and put that in first. So I'll let you work on that. And remember, your Kleenex is your friend. If you feel like anything's got away from you, gentle little dabs. If something looks too hard, if your line looks too hard and not soft, slightly wet brush is good. Just a little bit of slightly wet brush can make your edges softer. And the reason these two colors, the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, are great is because they don't stain and they wash off really easily. So if you make a mistake, you can use a wet brush, you can use a Kleenex, you can take the color off again. And we're definitely going to use that when we wash off this streak of light later. We're going to use the fact that we can wash this off really easily to wash it back. I wanted to put this on because yesterday there was some confusion about where the head of the heron was and where the parts of the heron were on here. So I wanted to give you a closer look if you don't have one. And the beak of the heron is quite slender, so you'll want a very small brush for that. And then the neck dips down, and these two wings and the tail and the very thin legs, and you'll need a very, very thin brush for that. So what I'd like to paint next is the heron, mainly because we don't want to smush the wet paint of the foreground while we're painting the heron, and it's right in the middle. We can paint it, leave it to dry. We don't have to go to the hairdryer. So we need to mix up a nice dark value of paint for the heron, and that paint's going to be useful for painting all of the mud in the estuary bank here. So it's going to be a very, very similar color. Now I'm going to use the burnt sienna that I've got here to mix my color. So I want more burnt sienna. And the way to get a color strong is don't wet your brush in between. Go to the paint, put the paint in here, go to the paint, put the paint in here, go to the paint, put it in here. Don't wash your brush, because that will introduce loads of water into the mix. Now I'm not even going to wash my brush. I'm going to my blue. I haven't washed my brush. I'll wash my paint later. It'll be fine. And put the blue in there. That's the ultramarine blue. And you can either add a little bit of sepia or burnt umber or Payne's grey. Either one is fine. I'm going to grab a little bit of Payne's grey. And that's going to make a nice dark mix. So you can use sepia, you can use burnt umber, you can use whatever you like to make that nice and dark. Not too watery, but not dry either. We can't paint with dry paint. It has to move around, but not be too diluted. And I have that ready there. And I'm not going to wash my brush. I'm just going to put it to one side because I'll need all that paint that's on the brush. So I have two brushes ready to paint the heron. I have my brand new Zero silver black velvet brush. Very beautiful. And for the legs, I want my 2/0 script liner brush to get nice thin legs and thin edges to the wings on the heron. So, and the way to load your brush is to roll it. Don't mix your color with your lovely little brushes. Use a nice big brush or an old brush to mix your color. Roll your brush in the color until it's loaded and it's got a nice point. And the same for your script liner. Don't scrub with it. Just roll the whole brush in the paint. And I got one in each hand because I want to put with the Zero brush, you can use a number 1 brush. I want to put the main part of the wing on. But right at the end, there's some little feathers sticking out. I'm going to use my script liner to get those little tiny thin feathers just sticking out at the end of the wings. Just a little detail. And if you want a nice dark heron, keep dipping. I'm dipping. I don't know if you can see, but every few brush strokes I'm rolling my brush again in the paint so that I've got plenty of paint to work with. It should just flow onto your paper without any effort whatsoever. It should flow out the tip of your brush. Now again, I'm going to use the script liner to get the sort of like feathers just sticking up at the end, and also the tail feathers a little bit split there. And the legs, of course, I'm not going to do them yet because I'll probably smush them with my hand. But I do want to, I'm going to do the head and the neck. And then I'm going to use the script liner to do the big, the heron has a really big beak, big fishing beak. Comes out very straight. I'm just going to put that nice straight beak on. To work very, very carefully with your small brush. Now the tops of the legs have feathers, so you can be a little bit bolder with your paint, but then they're very, very thin, and usually you can see that it has kind of like a back toe sticking out. So I put those out too. And then avoid adding too much more to it. Like if you keep sort of trying to add a little bit more, you'll end up with a flying squirrel or something like that. So keep it nice and delicate. They do have a little knobbly knee. You can put a little tiny knobble. You can actually even see them in the photo. And then of course we have to do the reflection. I'll let you do that, and then I'll have a little talk about the reflection and reflections in general. Now the reflection is just slightly lighter than the bird, very slightly, which means we're just going to add a little bit of water to the paint mix. And you can see that it's kind of linear, where the reflection is reflecting off of very tiny ripples in the water, so some of the reflections don't show. So you can make something look more like a reflection by having those horizontal kind of linear lines. Not all of it's really linear. The body is more solid looking, but you don't want to make it as solid looking as the actual bird. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to my... I don't want to add water to the whole mix. Whatever I do when I want to dilute a mix is I take a corner of the mix and I just add a little more color or a little bit more water just to the corner, because I want to use the rest of this paint in a moment. So I don't want to take it back too much. And the other thing I have right here beside me, I have some cheap, very cheap watercolor paper, and this is just for testing, just so I've got something to test my dilution on, or my color. And I can just pop it on there and see that looks fine. Put that back here. And I'm going to start with the legs. I don't want to get my hand in anything as I paint, so I want to start with the thing furthest away. Is put the legs on, not as obviously as the bird. And then the main part of the body, I'm going to paint it with horizontal stripes, but I'm going to connect them on the body. The tail sticks out a bit. And then we have the reflection of the neck and the head and the beak. Now where you really see the horizontal strokes is when they come out to this wing. So I want to leave a little bit of space between some of my brush strokes. And these connect a little bit more, so I'm going to connect those. And I'm actually going to emphasize what I can see on the photo, because I want it to look genuinely like a reflection, so that it's not quite as definite as the actual bird. Then I'll just leave that to soak into the paper and dry. We don't need to dry it with the hairdryer. All the while we're doing that, all of this area is drying nicely. We don't have to go to the hairdryer for that. And then we can use that nice dark color we made to paint in all this mud here in the foreground. Now if you look, in this mud here is water, it's reflecting. So we've got a bit of light reflection in here, especially in the foreground. As you go away from the viewer into the distance, you don't see that so much, so that pushes that into the distance. The other thing is these are mostly horizontal to the bottom of the page. If you have them sloping up at too much of an angle, it'll make it look like this is a mountain or a hill rather than a flat estuary. So you need to, if you're making your lines in the mud or your reflections, you need to keep them largely horizontal and disappearing into nothing in the distance here. Also, there's a slight change in color. This is quite light and dark here, and then here it goes a more sandy color. So we can actually sort of switch here to a raw sienna, burnt sienna sort of mix and make this area a little bit more of a sandy color. We will put another layer of mud over the top when that's dry. And you can work on this fairly slowly. I will probably switch to a number 8 brush, slightly smaller brush. Actually, what I'll do is, because my number 10 brush is full of paint, I will probably start with that and maybe switch afterwards, because I don't want to waste this brush full of paint here. And I'm going to use the point of my brush, let's get this up a little bit, to do the detail along the edge of the shore and skipping. Now you don't have to work fast or anything. You can work quite slowly to make sure that your brush is full of paint. And I'm going to just skip, leaving some of those places horizontal reflections, just reflecting that water. It doesn't matter if your skipping is too big or too wide at this stage. You can close it all up later with more brush strokes. And don't make the edge of the shore too what's the word, nice, too neat. It's all rocky and muddy, so you can have a rocky, muddy edge to it. I can't seem to find the language today for words I want to say. Smooth, that was the word I was looking for. Don't make it too smooth or too accurate. So just slowly, there's no rush. You can work on that, leaving those little spaces. The nice thing about a big number 10 brush is if you've rolled it in that paint, it's going to hold a lot of paint for a long time. And the paint will just slowly, like a pen, it will just slowly keep running down towards the tip of the brush so that you can paint without worrying about it running out or anything. Now I'm just sort of getting here now to the area where it changes color, so, and it's not so much wet here. I want to have like bolder, more joined up strokes. And going back here, you don't see as much wet either, so I'm going to get a little bit more water on my brush, dilute it just a little bit, and then I don't want as many things show. I don't want reflections showing back here. I just want a mud color. Like I'm going to have 1 or 2 here and there, but they will get smaller as they go into the distance. So remember, as things go away from you, they have to be smaller. I've kind of got to here, and now I want to add a little bit of raw sienna to this to change up the color. I'm going to add a bit of raw sienna. Grab some from here. Add some raw sienna to my color just to make it a bit more of a sandy, muddy color. And that's going to be this closer layer here. Now this is an underlayer. I'm going to have dark brown rocks and mud over the top of this. So this is the underlayer. And I'm taking my little zero brush, and if I feel that any of these little puddles are a bit too big, I can always close them up a little bit, add a little bit more color. Again, we're going to put some clumps of mud and texture into this with a second layer. There are, just out from the shore, there are a few rocks and things. I think there's a little bit sort of like weedy grass there. I'm just kind of breaking up the shoreline a little bit with a few interesting details. Now the bottom of my sandy part here looks very light at the moment, but I will be putting a lot more dark mud over the top of that when it's dry. So this will be the under part that's underneath the muddy texture there. So it looks a bit off at the moment. It's got to be patient. Oh, how are you doing? Are you ready for the trees at this side yet? We're going to use our same brown color, and you can change it up a little bit if you want to. I'm going to have a little bit of burnt sienna in here, so I can just add it. Let's pull this over. I want it here so I can just dip my paintbrush in it and add it sometimes for some wet in wet detail. And over here I want to have the darker color, so that's the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue. Grab some blue from over here. And I also want to take one corner of that a little bit more diluted, so some of my tree is still in the mist and some's a little bit darker. Let's move this back over a little bit. Move this down. So what we're working on now is we're working on all of this darker tree over to this side. Now notice it's not as dark as this, not as solid as this, it's more misty, but we need it darker sort of down here where we're going to put the light strip later. So we want to keep this darker. Up the top here it's still more misty, so we want to have, that's where we want to have a little bit of the water diluting it. And we can start up there with the more misty tree. Now remember, you've got your very misty tree, your middle tree, and then this one is more over to the edge here. Now you'll probably need your Kleenex to take some of the tree back and make it more misty as you put it on. And I'm going to just use my brush for the first part. You can use your sponge after you've got this part on. Now that's too dark. I've got to get a bit more water on there again. So I'm putting my brush down sideways, and another thing you can do is you can take some of the paint off your brush on a towel or a sponge so that it's not as loaded with color, because what we want is we want that edge to the tree that's sticking out, and I want to sometimes just soften that edge so it's not so visible. And by using my brush on its side, I can sort of scrape it along a little bit and not have such bold colour, if you know what I mean. I want it to be kind of soft and misty. When we get to the edge of the tree here, I want to see some of the branches coming out. And again, like just touch them with your Kleenex if they're looking too hard in edges. Now and you can work slowly again, like the shore. Like I'm going back up here, adding a few more leaves showing. A little bit of Kleenex up here is a little bit more showing. Adding a little bit more paint. Definitely near the edge. You don't want it too open near the edge. The tree is more open as it meets the other trees. And then there's sort of a part in the, I'm looking at the photo in front of me, there's a part that kind of comes down here like this. I'm using the side of my brush. Getting a definite tree shape to the edge, not just a blah, you know, not just a whole blob of tree. There's got to be this middle tree in here and this faraway tree. Don't take it out too far, and pay attention to the photo. So what I'm looking at is this kind of this big part of the tree here, and this bit that sticks out here, then there's a bit that sticks out here, and then there's some like muddy bank or something here that's very indistinct. There's kind of a stick here, and we're going to make just indistinct brush strokes for what we can't see there. I think it's mostly reflection in the water. I'm working with my number 8 brush at the moment. And I've just got a little bit more water on it. As it comes down here, it's getting darker. And as it starts to get close to the water, where I think these are reflections, the brush strokes you use can be more horizontal. I'm just gonna take a little bit up with my Kleenex, not everything. If you keep dabbing everything up, you're going to lose the colour. You just want to have some mistiness. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to my mix, because under here, the reflections are a little bit more blue, a little bit darker. I think if I look at the photo clearly, there's a bit of branch here too, but we'll worry about that in a minute. I'm gonna, yeah, I've got my line down here that we're going to brush out in a minute. I'm going to take that because I need to take the dark all the way down here. I've got a wet brush now, nothing but a wet brush, and I'm just going to ease these shadows out a little bit with a wet brush. They're quite dark over here. I'm gonna gently ease them out. I know it looks a little messy to start with, but then when you get a few darks in and we're going to brush that light out, you're going to see a little difference. Now I've got just the burnt sienna here. I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth to the edge here. Little dab. I don't want too much of an edge right there. I want a much softer edge. So I'm just going to wet that a little bit, dab it. Get that a little bit softer. And take a little bit of the burnt sienna into the wet that I just put there. Just get a little bit more warmth in that shadow with the burnt sienna. Wet brush to manipulate it. And then a bit more dark over here. Now we still have some darks to put in there yet for the very dark kind of branches at this side, and we've got all the dark in the shore to put in yet. But at the moment the paper's fairly damp, so I'm not going to be able to get that in without lifting paint off and making cauliflowers. So I have to dry at this point before I can do any more work on these trees or any more work on the shoreline here. As you cannot work on damp paper. It doesn't take the paint. Now I'm going to mute my microphone and just get my hairdryer again and get this dried off a little bit. There, that's got that nice and dry. I'm going to get some clean water, because that's important. I'm going to keep that lighter watery mix and mix a bit more dark here. Oh, keep putting my paintbrush into both my clean and my dirty water. I'm adding a little bit of Payne's grey to my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna mix to get it a little bit grayer dark. Again, I don't wash my brush out in between, otherwise you dilute your mix out too much. And keep my brush, I don't need to wash my brush, I'll wash all that paint out. But if I do want to wash my paint, you just need to get a cheaper brush and just run your brush over the paint a couple of times, wet brush, and your paint's clean again. I don't always use a clean brush on my paint unless it's yellow. I don't want to contaminate that, but if it's any other color, they're okay. They can suffer having some other colors put in them, and you can wash it off later. Otherwise you just can never get a nice intense dark mix. Right then, now how are we doing? That's what I'm having a look. I'd like to show you the step where we're going to wash back this piece of light that's pointing at the heron. And you might say, well, why didn't we paint around it? That's incredibly difficult. You're always, as you're painting these colors, if you try and paint around this, you're always going to go over the line and you're going to get a blurry line. So what I like to do is get to a fairly dark stage and then wash back, but you have to use colors that don't stain, which is why I haven't used any staining colors. And I have a pencil line to help me here. Now I'm going to put my masking tape on the pencil line that I have, very, very light pencil line. And then I'm going to take another piece of masking tape, and I want to make a very thin triangular, very, very thin triangular line coming out. It's kind of pointing at the feet of the heron. I'm going to burnish that down, get myself a very nice clean Kleenex. Use a Kleenex because they're soft, very soft. And then I want a stiffer brush. I've got this little one here. It's made by Silver Black Velvet, but it's made for acrylic painting, and it's called a scrubber. And it was, I think, $2 or something from Iron Oxide, maybe $2.99. It was not expensive. And it's nice and firm, so I can wet it. Got nice clean water on it. And I'm not going to scrub too hard. I don't want to damage the paper. But I'm just kind of easing the water along that gap in the masking tape towards the point of this arrow or triangle. And then I'm cleaning the water off in the same direction with my Kleenex. One more time. Just ease the water along there. Pull it back. And then you don't want to pull masking tape off wet, and you don't want to pull it off cold a lot of the time, because you might lift the paint or you might tear the paper. So I'm going to be noisy for a second. Just going to dry and heat it up, and then very gently, because you don't want to rip the paper or take the paint off. Just going to tape that back. Now you can see we've got a lovely, clean, very sharp line going through the water there. And it had one in the photograph. This is the photograph here. But it's a much nicer line than just trying to paint around it. Now you can still use this line to paint around it when we do the darker color. And I find it actually helpful to have the line there when we do the kind of last layer of dark color, where you can put a little bit more dark under the reflection and some dark above the reflection. It just helps to have it there then for the final layer. We've got a few darks to put in. One little thing I like in the photo is, I'm going to get my little zero brush. There is a little stick sticking out of the water, and I kind of like that. I'm looking for the photo now. I like to make sure I've got it here. It's just, and it's sort of just sticking out. It kind of just shows that it's water, or there's a little bit of a reflection under it. And it shows that there's some texture and trees and stuff. With my little zero brush, I'm just putting in a few. You can see a few branches over here. And then on some of them, I'm just going to dab them so they're not too... Some people actually dab with their finger. I don't want to at this stage. I'm going to go to my number, let's see, I've got a number 4 brush here, so not so big of a brush now, and the darker paint. And I want to paint in some darker reflections under that line that I just made. Now I've dabbed my brush off so it's cleaner and drier, and I'm just going to use that cleaner, drier brush to just drag those reflections out a little bit. See how you can kind of control it? Now it's okay to do that on your final layer of dark, because you don't disrupt the line too much. But you can imagine if you were trying to keep that line with 2 or 3 layers, it would be much more difficult. Now I've got the point of the brush and a little bit of that dark paint, and I'm just putting a little bit more reflection on. And the same thing above the line. I've got the line now to guide me, and I'm going to put a little bit more dark above the line, because in the photo I can see a lot more dark. I put that dark on, and now clean brush, dry it off a little bit, and I'm going to soften all that in with a clean dry brush. So going up, slowly up from the edge. Now I'm already thinking I want it a little bit darker over here. Now I am adding a little bit more dark over there. We're giving it a little bit more dimension now. Now I'm going to get this soft brush again, and I'm going to see if I can add a little bit of more sort of bushy tree here with the soft brush. And I've even got, I don't use a fan brush very often, but I'm going to try it out and see if I can get a little bit of, I don't like the fan brush that much. But what I want is just some suggestion of sort of darker bushes over there. No, I'd never like fan brushes. They don't do it for me. Try the sponge even. Try all sorts of things until you kind of get what you want. And try a little bit more of the sponge. I think that's working better for me. And up here. And I'm dipping this in the very dark brown paint that I made. I go back to my paintbrush. Sorry, you can't see the top here. Let's just bring it down a bit and closer like that. There, I think that's a bit better maybe. I've got my wet brush again, my wet number 8, and I'm going to just do a bit of manipulation of that sponge work that I did. I don't want it too obvious. I want some of it to be more brushwork. And some of it under here is definitely, if you look at the photo, it's definitely sort of linear like reflection. So I'm going to pull that into, you see how it's very back and forth. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of sponge, a little bit of water, a little bit of brushwork, make some assessments. And as you go back and forth, it comes together. It takes a little while, and along the way you can feel like you've lost your way and it's not looking like anything. But you have to do that back and forth. And then I want to get my small brush. This is my little 0. And I'm going to put a little bit more like branch work in here coming out, because you can kind of see a little bit more here. And you can definitely see quite a lot of foliage over here. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to the mix, ultramarine blue. And over here it's really quite dark, so I'm just going to now go in with the real darks over here And I've added ultramarine blue to that brown mix, just a little bit. Now wet brush again. I don't want it to not blend with what's already there, so I've got to use my wet brush, which I've washed and slightly dried off, to ease all of this dark into the paint that's already on there. And while I have that nice dark colour there, then I've got to start, I can always, if that looks a little bit too dark, always take a little bit back with a Kleenex. Don't take off too much. But now I have that dark colour, I can start working on some of the mud over here too. As it goes back here, it's fairly dark, so it wants to kind of match the dark of the trees, not be darker and not be lighter, but kind of match your darkest dark of the trees over there. Every so often I wash my brush and use just water on my brush to ease in those colours and blend them a little bit. And the more paint I put on, the more I realise I needed just a little bit more dark in some places. Now remember, as this muddy bank goes away from you, you don't see too much detail, so I'm doing minimal detail back here. And you don't see much water reflection. But as this comes towards you, and a little bit more ultramarine blue, as it comes towards you, you've got a lot more detail. There are quite big splodges. You need more blue. There's quite big splodges of mud here. I got a little bit more water on my brush, so it flows a little better. And over here it's quite dark. I'm just using fairly big, broad brush strokes. Again, with that horizontal, you've got to be horizontal or it will look like you're painting a big hill, a big slope. The horizontal keeps this shoreline flat. And that's really important. Now the clods of mud and stuff, they go over the sand and over this mud here. And sometimes it's just dark and sometimes you can see big clods of mud. So vary your brush strokes, sometimes connect your brush strokes and sometimes disconnect them. Keep them horizontal. I'm going to take a clean damp brush, no paint on it, just a little bit of water, and I'm going to connect a little bit of this up so that by doing that with just a damp brush, I'm softening all this and making the dark blend into the light sandy background. And if you don't go dark enough with this layer, do another layer. If you you know, it dries up and you think, oh, that looks too light. Then you can go back with another layer when it's drier. That's fine. Now, you can see I've got big broad brush strokes in the foreground here. Very small, very indistinguishable brush strokes as it goes away from you. And over here, of course, is all the reflection of the water in the wet mud. And I might disconnect a few of those reflections a little bit with some more mud. And by that time, this is all kind of drying, so I can see if this is dark enough compared to this over here. And I kind of feel that this one is a bit too bitty compared to the photograph. I might want to take some of that paint and connect a bit of this and not have it quite so bitty. Make it more indistinct in the mist. Again, I've connected it, dab it down a little bit. And take a little bit of that off. The key is not to overdo it, but get it dark enough that you have the contrast of the light and the dark. Not too dark, but not too light either. You can always add more paint. It is a little bit harder to take it away, but like I showed you with this one over here, I did wash all this paint off yesterday and I'm just putting it back on again, and then I'll have to do a bit more texture. The other thing I did to this one yesterday was I added quinacridone gold over the whole thing when I'd finished because I felt that it was too light. So that's another thing you can do. What you need to make sure is that this is all absolutely perfectly dry before you do something like that, because all of these colors are going to be lifted by water. Even your heron will be. So if you're going to put a glaze of another color over the top, it has to be really, really dry, and you have to be kind of careful how you do it. And I don't advise it unless you really, really feel that it's too light. The quinacridone gold is very intense and staining, so it's not something that I'd want to put on straight away, because it could just be, if it's too bright from the outset, you know, it's over from the beginning. You've got it too bright, too intense, too staining, and you haven't even started yet. I think it's much better to go gently with gentle color to start with until you find your way, and then if you want to put a little bit more dark color on, glaze it on later. So I'm going to dry this. I'll mute a minute and dry this so that we can sort of take the tape off and see how it looks when it's dry. I'll let you paint on. Okay, so mine is pretty dry, I think. I'll take my tape off, get rid of this messy edge. And this one is quite a quick one today for a start off. I tried to pick the simplest, quickest one for our starting lesson, so ease you back in gently. I do have some that are going to take us a lot longer planned for the other weeks. Next week will be fairly quick, I think. Let's take that off of there. That looks all right. It's always better once the tape's off, and it's a lot lighter than I think I put the gold over this one yesterday, so this one's a lot lighter. I have to say, the more I look at the the raw sienna one, the more I like the raw sienna one, which is interesting. I felt right from the beginning it wasn't yellow enough, but the more I look at it, the more I prefer it, I think. And in a moment, I want to talk about all the other lessons that I have planned, so you're ready for what's coming up. And things you can think about. Get my crisps. What I usually do for the fall is I plan at least one Christmas card that you could use for a Christmas card. So I've planned 2 Christmas cards this time, and we're going to do one next week, so that if you wanted to print them or if you wanted to do more, you've got it ahead of time. And then we're going to do skies for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we're going to do another Christmas card in between, and then a few more skies and silhouettes and things. So yeah, I've designed the Christmas cards so you can actually, if you wanted to, you can scan them and print them, or take them to Staples or somewhere and get them scanned and printed if you want to, if that's something that you want to do. Or you could just paint it as a little card like this. But I'll show you my ideas, and then you can adapt it to your ideas. So how did that go for you? Have you got a beautiful heron in a lovely misty scene? I hope so. Next week we're going to do one of the Christmas cards, which is the cardinal, and I would like to do it bigger and then shrink it down on the photocopy. It makes it easier to paint. So we'll see you next week. Bye for now.